Good afternoon and welcome to the Green Party 2020 State Convention. My name is Betsy Mitchell. I'm running for St. Louis County Executive, and I will be your moderator this morning. So we have, first up, I'd like to introduce to you Don Fitz. Don, are you on? Are you on the call?
Okay, Angela's going to go first. And
Angela? Okay, all right. Yeah. Well, let me introduce Angela then. Angela is the Vice President for the Green Party for the United States. So we would like to present Angela Walker.
Well, good morning, everybody. It is my honor and it is my pleasure to be here with all of you and to be meeting you and talking with you and included on a panel about something that I believe in so much. And so, you know, I'm not going to take up a bunch of time, but I just wanted to say good morning and what a pleasure and an honor it is to be here with you today.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you so much for your warm words this morning. Secondly, is Don Fitz, or are you going last?
I'm going last.
Okay. Margaret Flowers, who is the co-chairman for the Green Party. Hello, Margaret. Margaret?
Try it without my headphones. Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yes. Hi,
okay.
Margaret.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Betsy, and thank you to everyone for inviting me to be a part of this today. I'm just a past co-chair. My term just ended in July. So, but I am active in my state and local Green Party and on the national committee. Don asked me to speak a little bit about Cuban healthcare and from the perspective of being a physician in the United States. So I want to take a few minutes to do that, if you'll indulge me. And you know, the United States is facing, in some ways, I think, a situation similar to what the Cubans faced around the time of the revolution, where we have a healthcare system that is really designed for the wealthy. It's a for-profit system that treats healthcare as a commodity. We are losing our facilities in rural and poor communities. So these are very underserved communities. And we're also in a time of great crisis. We're facing a number of very severe crises, from the climate crisis to expanding militarism, a recession that will likely be a depression, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic, which is really exposing a lot of the faults in our current healthcare system. Healthcare is a #1 issue for voters, and in this presidential election, both major party candidates are opposed to Medicare for all, a solution that the majority of people in the United States support. So if people support Medicare for all, that would not be consistent with voting for a Democrat or a Republican. People really need to vote for the Green Party candidates, Howie and Angela, if they want to show support for national improved Medicare for all. I had the privilege of spending some time with health professionals from Cuba a few years ago. A delegation came to Maryland, and I helped in organizing events for them at universities and hospitals. So that was really an opportunity for me to learn from them how their system is organized, the innovations that they've developed, and the health outcomes, you know, especially things like improving infant mortality, things that I care about as a pediatrician. So I just wanted to talk about 3 kind of aspects of the Cuban system and how that compares to the US system. And one is that their system is literally based on health. It's about improving the health of their people, identifying health problems, and then working to solve those. In the United States, I started practicing in the early 1990s, and I started out at a rural hospital. And that was just around the time that things were really changing to make healthcare a commodity and more of a for-profit sector. We were still able to have some input at this rural hospital. We were able to push to equip our paramedics with pediatric equipment and train them in pediatrics. We brought in speakers to the hospital to educate the community physicians. We built a level 2 nursery because we were seeing a real increase in the 4 years that I was at that hospital. We saw a doubling of our births at the hospital. And we were able to take a systemic approach to looking at whenever we had a bad outcome in a birth, we would bring everyone together and look at what happened in this community to, that could have been prevented. You don't see that anymore. Right now, physicians are really literally cogs in a for-profit machine, and you're discouraged from, trying to actually do things to improve the health that wouldn't bring a profit to the hospitals or the places where you work. This is really like undermining physicians' ability to provide care to their patients. And it's also kind of putting physicians psychologically in a really bad space where we're seeing, real levels of physician suicides as well as physician burnout in the US. Another factor is that the Cuban system is based on relationships. Physicians live in the communities where they practice. They're part of the community. They know the families know them. And so you really have that connection. In the United States, who physicians see as a patient depends on who's able to get into the door, who has health insurance. And you can spend time, as I did when I was a practicing pediatrician, getting to know a family, getting close to them, and then either the insurance company drops you as a provider, or the family changes jobs and changes insurance, or their business changes insurance. And then, for circumstances out of our control, we have to sever that relationship that we have developed. Also, in the United States, and this is one of the reasons I left practice, you're really on this like hamster wheel where the health insurance corporations determine how much you're reimbursed. They lower it or make it at levels that really don't work for you in a private practice. And so physicians are forced to see more and more patients and spend less time with them. And so that's really goes against the ability to provide high quality care. And then the third thing is that in Cuba, they're really able to be proactive. They can look at ways to improve health, to provide preventative care. And in the United States, we don't have a lot of time with patients, so we can't really get to know them and figure out what their social circumstances are and how we can provide advice to them. And then the other piece of that is that in the United States, because of all the financial barriers to care, patients wait a long time before they seek care, often waiting until they really can't wait any longer. And so, we spend so much time putting out fires as opposed to being able to really help people to be as healthy as they could be. So we need to start recognizing that healthcare is a right. It's not a commodity as it's treated in the United States. And I was fortunate to help Howie Hawkins and Angela Walker develop their healthcare platform. So I encourage you to look at that on the howiehawkins.us website. It's a two-phase kind of program that begins with immediately extending Medicare to every person living in the United States, regardless of citizenship status, just so that we can get everybody into a system where everyone has comprehensive care without co-pays or upfront costs, so that all healthcare needs are met. And then it's really about building an infrastructure in the United States for healthcare, moving towards a national health system that's democratically controlled by communities, that takes a proactive approach of looking at where we need health resources and getting them there, looking at what our health issues are and how we can systemically address those health issues. So I'll stop there and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
You're muted, Betsy.
Betsy, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry, and I really like that introduction. Oh my gosh, and it was just for myself. I said, and last but certainly not least is Don Fitz, the author of The Cuban Healthcare, The Ongoing Revolution. So we're going to present Don Fitz to you, and he's a great guy. I really just really appreciate him and love him. So Don, you're up next.
Okay, fantastic. I don't think you can see me on the screen, but I'm wearing my special t-shirt that says Missouri Green Party in great big thick green letters. So just imagine that you're saying Missouri Green Party on a t-shirt. Okay, what I want to talk about today is that what Cuba shows us is that Medicare for all is the beginning point. It's not the end point of what we should be looking for in medical care. What we really need to have is community medicine with natural and traditional medicine, and we need to spread medicine across the world and not just in the United States. And in talking about how to connect these, I'm going to pull together three themes: Medicare for all, and then the attack on the Cuban healthcare system, which is going on right now, and the current crisis of COVID-19. And unless we deal with all of these three together, we're not getting a complete picture, because the big picture of what's going on is that there's not just a struggle of Medicare for all, there's a struggle to make medicine worse than it has been in the past, and to undo all of the gains of the last 60 to 70 years. Gains like minimum wage, ending child labor, protection of federal lands, Medicare and Medicaid, every gain, there is an effort to undo that. And the Democrats and Republicans only argue about how fast it should be undone. Okay, first of all, let's look at Medicare for all. That is more or less what the Cuban medical revolution was in the first few years of its revolution. They expanded medical care to people who were not receiving it. And very soon, as they were expanding medical care, they realized they needed to send staff overseas and both bring other people to Cuba. So within 5 years of the revolution, they began the transformation of redesigning their healthcare system. And this is what Margaret Flowers was talking about when she talked about medicine in the community. It was actually 30 to 35 years before that concept was fully developed in Cuba. And basically what they did during this time period is that Cuba has what I would call allopathic medicine, which is the traditional medicine of cutting and drugging. But Cuba also incorporated all the traditional medicines that Cuba had. And as they went to other countries, they included their traditional medicine in those patterns. So the Cuban system today has several features. One is the concept, what we know as Medicare for all. Everybody should receive complete health care as a human right. A second is that all parts are fully integrated into a single whole. And we don't see anything vaguely resembling that in the United States, where there's different healthcare systems in every state and every community. And the third part of Cuban healthcare, which I think is extremely important, is that every citizen and every medical care professional has input into the system, so that the medical system reflects the experiences of the country. Okay, let's look at the attacks on the Cuban healthcare system. They show that you can receive better outcomes in the US system while spending less than 10% per person per year on Cuban healthcare. The healthcare professions and the corporations do not want that example to spread across the world. Cuba has trained over 30,000 doctors, and in addition to a very large number of healthcare professionals across the world. And what's done during COVID-19 is just some examples of Cuban medicine is that when Italy was the epicenter of COVID-19 just a few months ago, Cuba sent 52 doctors and nurses to Italy. And you had the first example of a poor Caribbean country sending medical care to a rich European power. Then another example, the same month in March of this year, there were 50 crew members and passengers on the British cruise ship Braemar that had COVID-19. It was in the Caribbean. And so they wanted to dock in the Bahamas, and the Bahamas said, you will not be able to dock here. So during the next 5 days, the Braemar went around the Caribbean trying to find a place to dock. Nobody would let it dock. And on March the 18th, Cuba became the only country to allow the Braemar to let its people off in and receive medical care in Cuba. So over the past 6 decades, there have been over 200,000, over 400,000 Cuban medical professionals sent overseas, and they've saved the lives of hundreds of millions of people. And the reason I bring that up, a lot of people have talked about reparations for oppressed people in the United States, but it's not just the United States, it's the world. And I think the best way that the United States could pay reparations for the devastating effect it's had on the world is to provide health care for all the billions of people on the globe, which we easily could afford to do. Now, the United States has been attacking the Cuban healthcare missions. That's what they call them when they send doctors and nurses overseas. They've been attacking that repeatedly. And in 2006, George W. Bush set up what's called the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program. And so they were trying to persuade doctors to desert Cuba and to come over to the West and receive all the financial benefits. And actually 2 to 3% of the Cuban medical doctors took them up on that, but 97 to 98% stayed with Cuba, even though their salaries were much less than they would be if they moved to the United States. What we see in this attack on the Cuban healthcare system is that in the last few years, before COVID-19 hit, Brazil ousted the leftist government. Then it was Brazil, and then Ecuador, and then Bolivia. And all of them threw Cuban doctors out of their countries. There were hundreds in each country. And these are the countries that have suffered some of the worst devastation in the third world. And just comparing Cuba to the United States, we see that on July 15th, the United States had 135,000, almost 136,000 deaths, and there were a total of 87 in Cuba. Even though the Cuba population, even though the US population is only 30 times that of Cuba, it had 1,563 times as many deaths. And Bolivia was particularly hard hit because Bolivia is a very isolated country, and smaller than Cuba, but it had 22,000 deaths because when kicking out the doctors, the Moreno government destroyed any sort of centralized healthcare system. Now we need to put this into perspective. Over the last few centuries, capitalism has exterminated hundreds of millions, if not billions of people to encourage corporate growth. So the mass death during COVID-19 includes the worst countries, the worst systems that defend medicine for profit. And those are the US, India, and Brazil, all of which are headed by far right-wing governments who do not want to have Medicare for the people. And so what we see during COVID-19, which is basically a mass slaughter, is a continuation of an ongoing process which has spread through Latin America, Asia, and Pacific Islands. And today, when we talk about the horrors of slavery and they're driving native peoples off the land, that driving native peoples off the land is not something which is just in the past that we can shake our heads and forget about. It's an ongoing process today throughout the world. And it's important to remember that the Democrats have little difference from the Republicans. It's true that Donald Trump is one of the worst buffoons in the world, but the Democrats, no more than the Republicans, will mention that Cuba has developed interferon alpha 2B decades ago in the 1980s. And that is a very effective treatment that dozens of countries have asked for Cuba, but the US do not want to do that. Okay, let me just give you an example of there's some examples I would like to go over, but I'm about out of time. Let's give an example of what a profit system does. One of the worst health indicators that people have is obesity. And in the United States, you see one program after another treating obesity, treating people's overweightness as an individual problem and talking about what individuals should do as if the individual person is to blame. What a revolutionary medical approach would do is the first thing is to attack the whole food industry, which introduces horrible chemicals and highly sugarized corn syrup into virtually all the food we eat. We can't really deal with obesity unless we deal with the food industry. And what I want to close on is saying that that we think that we may not be able to accomplish anything now because it's in such a reactionary period of American history. Now, I'm older than most of the people on this call, so I lived through Richard Nixon being president. And I remember that in 1969, when he came into office, he had just won an overwhelming pro-war victory where there was only one state voted against him, I think. And despite all of the reactionary policies that Richard Nixon wanted to enact, he ended the war in Vietnam. He started the food stamp program. There was decriminalization of abortion, recognition of China, first creation of the EPA, passage of the Freedom of Information Act, formal dismantling of FBI's COINTEL program, creation of earned income tax credits, a formal ban on biological weapons, and passage of the Clean Water Act. We have never won so many victories, whether a Democrat or Republican has been in office since then, since that time. So what we really need to do is to realize that the Democrats, voting for a Democrat is not going to bring us the sorts of changes that we need. We really need a complete transition, the sort of transition that Howie Hawkins and Angela Walker are pushing. Okay, I think we should be time for comments and questions.
Yes, questions.
I have a question. My question is for Angela Walker. Can you speak a little bit about what your and Howie Hawkins' kind of Medicare for All game plan is? Can you speak a little bit about that? Please.
Sure. And I, forgive me for not being able to get into the nuts and bolts of it. I don't have it in front of me and don't like to misspeak. But like Cuba, our Medicare for All program, which is the thing that, because I get asked a lot, how is it different from that diluted PAP that was offered to the people by the Democratic Party? And the key piece of ours is community control, and that health boards are locally elected. The people who are, providing service providers are salaried. And so you're taking away profit motive, as Margaret said earlier, where doctors are being pushed through and they're not given the time to get to know the people that they're caring for, get to know those communities that they're caring for. You're taking that away. And also, moving big pharma out of the picture, and and there's a lot of wording around and like I said, I don't have it in front of me, but the key to our program is that it is community controlled. And one of the biggest things that I have always appreciated about the Cuban healthcare system, I was introduced to it years ago when a doctor featured in the documentary Salud. If y'all haven't seen it, trust me, you want to. I sat in my chair and cried that I live in a country that has no concept of what true healthcare is, and I would argue actively colludes in the murdering of its people. And that was my introduction, and it just blew my mind that you could have doctors and nurses who not only knew their communities but lived in it. And so that's one of the things that, bringing community control and accountability to our Medicare for All program, that is a centerpiece of it.
Could I just jump in and add something to what Angela Walker just said? I've seen Salute. It's a wonderful movie. I totally agree that if you could get a copy of it, you really should be watching it. And Ms. Walker talked about getting big pharma out of the picture. One of the first things that was done after the Cuban Revolution was to nationalize the pharmaceutical industry, because the Cubans realized it was a total ripoff.
Could I add a little bit to that as well? I helped Howie to develop this, and parts of it are actually based on the Ron Dellum's legislation that was in Congress for a long time about giving Democratic community control. But basically what we outlined is a two-phase situation where as soon as the legislation is passed on January 1st of the next year, everybody would be given Medicare. This is something that we could transition to extremely quickly in the United States. And I worked with Sanders' staff in the past on his legislation. I've worked closely with John Conyers for a long time on HR 676, the Medicare for All, and then advised Pramila Jayapal on her legislation that I could not convince Sanders and Jayapal to do a rapid transformation to a Medicare for all, and they could not come up with any valid reason of why they wouldn't do that. And I tried to impress upon them the number of lives that would be lost by delaying for 2 to 4 years before the system was implemented. Every health professional in the United States has a national provider number, so we could immediately move to a national Medicare for all. And then as the first step, so that Medicare for all would include everyone, cover all medically necessary care, as well as home care, compensation for home care providers. Many people are taken care of in their homes by family members, but those family members aren't given support to do that, and they should be. It's a job. It helps our healthcare system when they do that. And then also creating an infrastructure at the local, state, and federal level to have community input into the system. And the other initial step is also making sure that all of our health facilities are either publicly owned or not for profit. And if a facility refuses to go that way, then they would be purchased by the system and brought into the control of the system. Then after that, starting to put in place the infrastructure for a national health system and making the pharmaceutical and medical device industry publicly owned and run. So if the system is negotiating with a pharmaceutical company or a device company and they refuse to have a reasonable price, then the government would have the right to just seize that facility and start production of that on their own to be able to offer things at a reasonable price to people. We would also have a yearly review that starts at the local level, at the county, feeds into the state, and then into the national, that informs how our healthcare system is doing, what our needs are. And from that, we would have a public health commission that would look at these reviews and decide, prioritize areas of need. So in terms of building infrastructure, we're losing hospitals. In 1975, we had a 1.5 million hospital beds and a population in the US of 216 million people. Now we have less than 1 million beds, fewer than 1 million beds, and we have 330 million people in our country. And this is because we're losing hospitals in rural areas and poor communities in cities that are being gentrified. So we need to rebuild those and make sure that every community has access to the care it needs. We would also then move towards public acquisition of all health facilities and look at also health education, providing for health professionals at every level, social workers, counselors, pharmacists, dentists, medical students, nurses, nursing assistants, would be offered for free, with the expectation that those workers would then work in the system for at least 15 years to give back having that free education. And then there's more, but those are kind of the basic parts of it.
So I have a question. Don, what did you learn from writing your book, and why did you call it Ongoing Revolution? And then for all three panelists, I think I read somewhere from the National Committee, I guess it was Kevin and Margaret, that there is no one currently going to help us out of the COVID crisis. What do the three of you think our steps should be? Or how can people take over control of this process? Because there's a vacuum. There is no one going to help.
Okay, could I say a few words about Cuban doctors in the United States who went to Elam and who are influenced to a small amount the medical system today. In 1988, a woman named Catherine Hall Trujillo of Albuquerque, New Mexico, founded the Birthing Project USA. And she wanted to work with African-American women during the preparation for childbirth and during the first year of the infant's life. And she immediately started to collaborate with doctors who had been to Cuba or had been trained in Cuba. And a couple of years ago, she told me, and this is a direct quotation, "We are a coming home place for Alam students." Alam is the name of the medical school there. They see working with us as a way to put into practice what they learned. And the medical advisor is Sarpoma Sefa Bayoki, who is an Alam graduate. And so they are providing, their inspiration is from Cuba, and they are providing medical care in the way that a Cuban system would work. The other person I want to talk about is Dr. Melissa Barber. She has worked in the South Bronx addressing COVID-19. And she realized that what people need is folks to go to the community instead of just having them come to the US. And so what she does in her neighborhood is identify people who are vulnerable, such as the elderly, people who have infants and small children, homebound people, people who have multiple morbidities and are really susceptible to a virus like this. That's a direct quotation from her. And so in that community approach, they go out and look for people in the neighborhood, low-income people, and they bring them the things that those people need. Now, a central difference between the way COVID is being dealt with in the United States and the way it has been dealt with in Cuba, and why there's such an enormously fewer deaths in Cuba. In the United States, you have to go, the people have to go to an agency to ask to be tested and to tell them what they need. And of course, most people don't even say things like, "I don't have enough food." Well, you know, because the health agency will say that's not our problem. In Cuba, instead of people going to the agencies, the doctors and nurses go to the people. Every single person in Cuba, 99.99%, had a medical student going to their home, asking them what sort of things that they needed in order to survive COVID-19. And this actually happened the changeover is very old. It happened in 1974. Cuba had gone through 10 years of standardizing the clinics, having them all, you know, work to have a clinic in every neighborhood in the country. But by 1974, they realized that there was a problem. And a Cuban doctor who lived through that transformation told me what they did in 1974 was that they changed clinics from where people had to go to the clinics to where clinics went to the people. And so they had physicians and nurses and medical students going from the clinics to the neighborhood. And that was a fundamental transformation time. And that is that was really the beginning of Cuban community medicine. And if you say, do we have community medicine in the United States? No, we really don't. Because what happens is that still there may be medical staff in the community, but it's very, very rare that these medical staff go to the people instead of the people going to them. Another thing that I wanted to mention about these examples in the United States, we may ask, well, is this very small, and is this just, you know, do-goody by a few physicians who aren't going to accomplish much? And the answer is no, it's enormous. And this is the reason. All through the late 1940s and 1950s, before the Cuban Revolution of 1959, there was almost a civil war between the different medical factions and the medical associations of Cuba, with a huge number of Cuban doctors saying the problems of poor people are not our problems, and a huge number of doctors saying, yes, they are. And so what you saw after the revolution was the departure of almost half the Cuban doctors to Florida, because those were the doctors, by and large, who did not believe that it was the responsibility of the medical system to go to the people. And the doctors and nurses who stayed were the ones who said, no, the medicine means beginning medicine in the community.
And just to jump on, you know, following the experts, I did pull up, so I'm not misspeaking and like grabbing out of the air based on what I remember, because I got 1,000 thoughts happening. But your question was also about what our administration or what our campaign plans for handling COVID. Is that, you know, making sure that I heard that right? And one of the things that, you know, is at the top of that, of course, is Medicare for all. And it also would pay for COVID-19 testing, and the big thing that Howie is like a real thing for him is like making sure that there is a test, trace, and isolate program in place so that we are able to monitor how COVID is spreading, where it's spreading, how it's moving. And, you know, that's something we need here. I live in South Carolina, and, you know, our numbers for COVID infections are spiraling up exponentially. I mean, it's not little, you know, a couple hundred a day. I'm looking at 900 every time I see it in the news. And Myrtle Beach, you know, is only an hour to the east of me. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. If you're watching the traffic, you see where it's coming from. You know, all of the folks on the cars that you see on the road are out-of-state people. And our mask mandates are very weak, and we're a tourist spot. So, you know, making sure we have a program of test, trace, and isolate. And also something that Cuba did at the beginning of COVID, which the United States could have done, and of course, under, you know, the command of the buffoon in chief, did not happen, and I'm being nice, was the fact that Cuba turned its production system around to address the COVID crisis. And something that had been done during World War II here in the United States, the Defense Production Act, to rapidly plan production and distribution of medical supplies, you know, getting it out there and making sure that, you know, the shortages of PPE that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, which my daughter and sister are both CNAs, and my daughter had PPE because a friend of mine made homemade masks, and I sent her the money to go get essential oils and Everclear to make her own sanitizer. And that was the PPE, because the facility that they work for did not provide it for any of their care providers, and therefore not for their patients. So making sure that, you know, we are turning our defense or our production facilities around to specifically address that crisis. And something other countries also had in place that is glaringly obviously absent is, because we don't approach things holistically in this country, as both Margaret and Don, you know, were saying, is making sure that people are financially supported during this time. So if we're asking people to be able to shelter in place and to stay, you know, to stay safe and not be forced out into a plague to serve capitalism, they have to have their rent paid. They have to have, you know, some sort of, you know, income coming in to make sure that their families are not going without. So under our administration, our proposal during COVID is $2,000 a month to every adult, $500 a month to every child for the duration of the crisis, so that, you know, folks are able to, you know, not have the added stress of financial burden on them. How am I going to live, essentially? And also providing, you know, the government would provide landlords and small businesses with the money that they needed to keep afloat, so that you don't have the economic collapse that we're looking at now, and, you know, an unimaginable eviction crisis. So, you know, those are just like, you know, I could go on forever, and I'm not going to do that, but they're, you know, just so people understand, this campaign, we do have a platform, and it's available on the website, so that y'all can see what our specific plan around COVID is, because we do have one.
If I could build off of what Don and Angela said, I mean, if we look at the countries that have dealt with the crisis well, it's countries that had a national system and national leadership that was very clear early on what needed to be done to deal with the pandemic. We don't have that here. I remember early on talking to my friends who are health professionals in New York City when they were being hit so hard, and they just weren't getting, you know, recommendations were changing like constantly. And so there was mass confusion on top of not being able to get PPE, you know, not being able to do the things they needed to do. So I don't see that changing in the United States anytime soon, in terms of having that national leadership, no matter what happens in November. And we're going into a really dangerous time as the flu season begins this fall, as, you know, schools are being forced to open, workers are being forced to go back to work because they aren't getting the support to be able to stay at home. So this is a whole confluence. And as Angela said, you know, infectious agents grow exponentially right? So one person goes out and infects 4 or 5 more. In some cases, it's been dozens more, and then they go out and infect more. So this is something that can snowball very quickly. So what that tells me is that we have to be active in our communities. We have to recognize that national leadership is best because, as Angela said, you can't just deal with one community and then you've got people coming in there, or people crossing the borders. If one state is relaxed and another is not, people, well, I can go to the restaurant over here because they're letting people eat in restaurants. So we really need a national strategy, but absent that, I think taking action in our communities, making sure that people are educated about how to protect themselves, making sure that folks have what we need. There's been a real increase in mutual aid going on, which has been tremendous. And that's necessary to get through both the COVID-19 pandemic and the depression that we'll be in for a very long time going forward. It's workers who are refusing to work unless they have safe working conditions, and communities should rally behind them. Teachers who are refusing to go to school. I think it was in Arizona, in one area of Phoenix, they decided to reopen the schools face-to-face, and then teachers didn't show up. So they had to shut down the school, right? We've got New York has voted to go on strike if they need to. Detroit voted to go on strike. And so we're seeing, even a national move towards teachers refusing to put themselves and their students families at risk. We need to be defining at the local level what it is that we need. In Baltimore, we pushed really hard to get food into our public housing communities. And the housing authority literally, after we gathered all this food, tried to arrest the woman from the community that was handing it out, and we pushed back. It got major attention and from the media, and then all this food started pouring in, and the mayor's office had to actually apologize to her for doing that. We pushed to get people who don't have housing into hotel rooms. We literally have a hotel in downtown Baltimore that's owned by the city, that was not not open, that we could put people into. So these are the kinds of things that we need to do in our communities as we demand for these changes and fight for these changes at the national level.
Are there any questions that have shown up on the chat box that we should be addressing?
Yeah, I'll just read it. Tommy asked, can someone address state efforts for Medicare for all, and why or why not would that be a productive way to pursue more of a state-by-state Medicare for all effort? Thanks, Tommy, for asking the question.
I can answer that if that's okay. Years ago, there was this, push for state, especially after we lost at the national level during the health reform process of 2009, 2010, that I was really heavily involved in. I was a congressional fellow for Physicians for National Health Program at that time. People started turning to the states, and I even helped to write state legislation. But the more I've learned and looked at it, you can't actually do a pure single payer system at the state level. There's about 8 different federal laws and policies that prevent that. So if you look at, first off, states don't have, under the ERISA law, they don't have the power to regulate employer-based insurance. So a lot of these states that wrote what they call single payer legislation was based on the premise that, we'll build this system, it will be so attractive to the businesses that they'll all ditch their private insurance and go into our system voluntarily, since we can't compel them to do that. But private businesses in the states like Vermont that tried it, Colorado, they pushed back. They're like, no, we're not doing that. Some private businesses have their own health insurance. They just have a insurance company administrate it, but they actually run their own health insurance systems and they make money off of them. So they don't want to give that up. So that's one barrier. Then you have all these federal programs like the Federal Employees Health Benefits Plans that offer federal employees a variety of different private insurances. We cannot force them to choose a state or go into a state system. The VA is a separate system. The Indian Health Service is a separate system. TRICARE for the military is a separate system that we don't have jurisdiction over. And then even looking at Medicare, Medicare has been privatized over the last few decades by the Medicare Advantage program, which the Obama administration promised to reduce. And in fact, it has grown exponentially, and it's continuing to grow exponentially as they suck more and more seniors into their private insurance scam. And so by law, seniors have a choice of Medicare plans, and we can't mandate that they go into the state plan. At the best is a state plan could apply to be a Medicare Advantage plan and then hope that seniors would choose it. But these private insurance companies, they have boots on the ground. Literally, Kevin, my partner's mother, we had her all set in a traditional Medicare program, and then she went to a senior center one day, and this nice guy came in illegally. They're not allowed to go into senior centers, but that's where the healthy seniors are, and literally convinced her that she needed a Medicare Advantage program, and we couldn't convince her the other way. She thought she'd gotten such a good deal until she was hit by a motorcycle this February and found out that it wouldn't cover the rehab she needed. We were able to get her back in traditional Medicare, fortunately, because it hadn't been that long. She's doing fine now, but you know, it's the state programs are not going to have that ability to go out and reach people and put them into the state plan. And so without having a single system, you don't get the savings that you need to cover everyone. And then states just also don't have the resources because their budgets are restricted, not like the federal budget where literally they can just be like, well, we want this money and yeah, we're going to fund the Pentagon so many hundreds of billions of dollars. So if you have some expensive patients in a state system, that can quickly cause a huge burden for the state. And that's what we've seen over the years as states have tried to move to universal systems, is that they became too expensive for them and they either had to start cutting benefits or kicking people out of the system. So, people talk about Canada and how they did it at one, province. And literally Canada in 1960s was a very different situation than what we're in right now. They already had a national hospital system that all of their hospital care was provided at the national level. And they were moving towards kind of socialized systems in a bunch of the different provinces at that point. I think what we would see if one state like California or New York tried to move to what they would call a single payer system, they would spend the next couple of decades trying to turn that into a single payer system and drop out of the national fight. So if we want a national Medicare for all, we need to actually be clear that that's what we're fighting for and fight for that. I talk with folks in the South who talk a lot about the Southern strategy that the Dixiecrats used, which was during the New Deal era to make lots of policies not national, like minimum wage requirements, things like that. They put that power into the state. Medicaid in 1965 was put into the states. That allows the states to discriminate, and some states to have a good system and some states to have a very bad system. And that's not what we're talking about with Medicare for all. We want a national system with equal benefits, equal rights for every person across the country.
One other thing that I'd like to step in and say is that when Margaret Flowers was talking about the expense of Medicare, you got to keep in mind, the expense of a state system, you got to keep in mind that the expenses of medicine in the United States are artificially inflated by capitalism. A real functioning Medicare for all system would cost less, and a Cuban type system would cost vastly less. It's the insertion of private ownership into every stage of medicine which makes these expensive.
I'd inject a couple points. One is that one of the reasons that the capitalists decided to move so many businesses overseas is because we were non-competitive in this country with the cost of labor. And one of the biggest costs of labor in our country is our overpriced medical system that takes a lot out, especially out of small businesses, is crushing. And the other point I would make is that already in our country, if you look at the people that are actually getting health care done to them, that over half of the health care that's actually delivered is already in some kind of a single payer system, such as Medicare and Medicaid and some of the other ones that are really kind of administered by the federal government. And so the ease of transferring the entire population is much more prevalent in this country than most politicians care to admit. We could switch our entire population over to a single payer system relatively easy by simply giving you a card at birth and then taking the card back when you die. And if you look at healthcare expenses, most of the healthcare that's done to people is in the last year or two of their life. And so we're actually talking about it, for the most part, an elderly population that's getting most of the healthcare procedures and things done to them. So it's not that difficult for the United States of America to make the switch. What is difficult in our country is the fact that we're owned and operated by the wealthy and their corporations, and they bribe our politicians and block what changes that should have been made many decades ago. I mean, it's clear that our healthcare system is twice as expensive as anybody else's in the world and gives really bad results. And we're all suffering from that, especially in the worst pandemic in the last 100 years, where we don't have a national healthcare system working on this problem. We have more than 50 little experiments going on in different directions, and many of them are causing problems. So the guys out in South Dakota decided to have a big motorcycle rally out at Sturgis, and now the guys that went out there to catch cobus are going to be spreading it all over the country on the way back. I mean, that, you know, maybe in a country that had actually a national healthcare system, we would have done it a little bit differently than that. Anyway, I'll turn it over to the rest of you. Thanks.
I think Chris was next. Chris?
Chris's
You are
question
muted.
was, what is the best way to express solidarity with Cuba? Explain internationalism versus nationalism.
The reason I'm asking this question is I did read Don's book, and the doctors in Cuba, they go to help people in other places that nobody will help. And they go through like swamps with snakes and spiders and infectious diseases to reach these people. So how do you get that? And it seems like the United States is the complete opposite, is they go to another country to dominate, whereas explain why internationalism is necessary for life on Earth, really.
Yeah, well, that's why I was saying that a good component of reparations is providing health care for the world. Cuba has provided health care for hundreds of millions of people, and it's a very small country without very many resources, and yet it can do that. And I mean, a good example of what Chris was talking about is if you think back to 2010, there's an enormous earthquake in Haiti. And Cuba was already in Haiti at the time and had doctors on the ground helping people. What most of the big countries did was they spent in a few doctors for what's called disaster tourism. And the doctors stayed in hotels that they flew by helicopter to at night. And they went out and they gave service during the day. They came after the hurricane and they left before the cholera epidemic started. Cuba doctors, in contrast, lived with the people. They lived with the communities who were devastated by the earthquake. Several Cuban doctors had been there before the earthquake happened. Many, many doctors stayed there after and were able to deal with the cholera epidemic, which followed next. One of the things that's important about Cuban medicine, I wrote an article about Che and COVID-19. You might remember that Che Guevara talked about making the new man. Now we would say making the new person. But Che considered medicine to be a calling, and Cuba and Fidel did also. And so what you see in every country in the world is that there's some doctors who want to do it just for themselves, because it's a good way to get recognition, to get money. And then there's doctors who do it as a calling. In the United States, the government and capitalism reinforces all the physicians who do it for money. And they get all sorts of stature and all sorts of power. And Cuba turned that upside down and started to reward doctors who would do it as a calling and started to preach that in the medical schools and make it part of every medical profession change, the change in every medical profession. That's why you can only see a few people in the United States really dedicated. It's swimming against the stream. It's where people, are not encouraged by the government industry to go. So the transformation in medicine, Medicare for all, that's why I say it's a beginning point, but it cannot be an end point, because we have to change the way that all medical professionals think about medicine to where they want to be fully and totally integrated into the community.
I really am amazed at how long this has gone on in my lifetime, where we're mad at the Cubans, and it's been so long we've forgotten why we're mad at them. I mean, they did have a communist revolution that basically overthrew our organized crime that was running their country. They were running the whole country down there and not really benefiting the people. The communists came in and took over, and that's almost unforgivable. But we managed to forgive Germany and Japan and Vietnam and, China, Russia. You can go down a long list of countries that we've been at war with. We've been at war with everybody over the years, most of our history. But for some reason, this lack of diplomacy towards Cuba has just gotten stuck in a neutral mode, and we can't seem to break out. They should be our best friends. They're close by. We've got lots of Cubans living in our country. They're practically our relatives now. I don't understand why we can't diplomatically become their best friends in the hemisphere. And likewise, they could do a lot for us with the examples that they set in medicine and other things. They have a very good reputation among the third world countries. So
I got out a little bit about what we could be doing. There is an effort right now to push for the Cuban doctors, the Henry Reeves brigades, to be given a Nobel Peace Prize, and so people can sign on and share that. We need to demand an end to the blockade, to the Cuban blockade. As Frank said, this has been going on now for decades and decades, and it needs to end. And this is we have a coalition of peace and other organizations working under a campaign called Sanctions Kill. People, should be aware that these, what we call sanctions, are actually unilateral economic coercive measures that are illegal, and the U.S. is employing them against a third of the countries in the world, and so we need to stop this. And so, I encourage people to check that out. And then in terms of internationalism, there's so much that we can learn. I've spent time in Venezuela and have connections with people in Venezuela, and what they're doing there is just astounding in terms of providing services to the poorest communities, providing housing, food, education, all these things. We have a lot to learn from that, here as social movements in the United States, about how they're organizing.
And again, our political decision to have sanctions against Venezuela for so long, it's been one of the sources of many of their problems. I mean, we've actually harmed that country a great deal with these sanctions, and I would throw Iran and quite a few other countries around the world where ours, from my standpoint, I think most of these sanctions have been a complete failure, and they haven't done anything to advance diplomatic relations with anybody.
I spent time in Iran last year, and what the sanctions have done, and they've done this in other countries as well, is they actually have galvanized the population together and against the United States. In Iran, there was, with the overthrow of the Shah, there was a real sentiment against Western culture. And the younger generation, I spent some time at the University of Tehran, they were questioning why their parents were so anti-Western. And then they started seeing what the US is doing with sanctions and things like that. And it has actually made them like, oh, now I understand why our parents are that way. So, and in Venezuela, there were legitimate criticisms of the Maduro government by people on the left, feeling like it maybe didn't go fast enough in terms of socializing the economy. But people muted those criticisms to join together against US imperialism there. So these economic measures actually are undermining.
There's a lot of mysteries about our diplomacy in general, and I'm not sure that we get our money's worth by shoveling millions of dollars every day towards Israel so that they can have a right-wing authoritative government and oppress their people, the Palestinians that actually live in that area as well. So, you know, I think our whole diplomacy thing needs to be looked at.
We have another question on the chat coming in through the stack. Says
Could I
at a
say something
time.
about sanctions against Cuba before we go on, Sue?
Okay.
Okay. A lot of people don't understand how the sanctions hurt the everyday person in the health system in Cuba. A lot of Cubans have a car, which are called máquinas, which is basically, it's a cross between a taxi and I don't know, a bus. But you have a certain route that you drive back and forth, and it's much cheaper than taking a taxi in the U.S. It's a few centavos to do that. But when they have something go wrong, it's extremely difficult for them to fix their car. Because in the United States, if you need a piece for your car, part, you just go to the auto shop and or the company that fixes your car just goes to the auto shop and buys it. In Cuba, the sanctions mean that they cannot buy the parts from the United States. And so the part would have to travel by boat to someplace like France, and then Cuba would have to buy it from France. And so every little thing that you buy that originated in the United States, it costs much more. When people actually have much less, it's very difficult. And this impacts enormously healthcare, because there's all sorts of things and equipment that Cuba needs for healthcare, like in the special period during the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed. There were times when people could not give operations because they couldn't repair the equipment fast enough. And so they would have to use a gasoline generated engine for power to have lights for an operation instead of doing surgery, when it was needed. So in every aspect of getting the medicines that people need that Cuba doesn't manufacture itself, or getting equipment, especially getting equipment repaired, it's much more expensive. And that's one thing that makes Cuban medicine so amazing. They can do so much more than the US, even when Cuba has to pay more than the US for the basic elements of putting the machinery of the medical equipment together.
Okay, the next question. At a time when privatization of institution after institution is proceeding at an unprecedented rate, giving more power and influence to the private companies, how do we educate people on what is happening to them?
I can speak a little bit to that, and what Margaret said after that, talking about what's happening to the post office, is an excellent way to make a good point about privatization. We've seen this playbook with, the work that I did around fighting the privatization of public schools in Wisconsin, which is related to the struggle to fighting against school privatization around the country. And, thinking of places like New Orleans, where it was just, folks were still underwater with Katrina when the privatizers moved in on their public school system. And, unless anything has changed, right now, if I'm not mistaken, there are no public schools in New Orleans. So this it's egregious. And I think that a lot of people, like if you're watching the comments around something like what's happening with the post office, people are not looking far enough because it's not how they're thinking. Like, oh, the mail is slow, or, but they're not looking at the bigger picture that someone has been appointed postmaster who also has ties to and like a very vested interest in the success of the competitor to the USPS. And they've been trying to privatize the postal system forever. First thing that they do is cripple it. You defund it, which we've seen with our public schools, so that it cannot work efficiently, so that you have all of these things happening that happen when you defund an entity. And then you move in as a privatizer and say, hey, look, this thing doesn't work. We've got something that actually works, and look how efficient it is, when they're selling you snake oil. It's garbage. And so I think that the most important thing, to educate people on what's happening is to point these out and to let them know that if someone's talking about how frustrated they are with public schools, how frustrated they are with the way that, their hospital works, or frustrated about, particularly now, with the post office, getting people to follow the money, getting people to follow, who's making the decisions that are impacting service to the point where we are now, that these things are not just the way it is, that these things are not, something that came out of the ether and all of a sudden, this entity just doesn't work, that it's intentional, which a whole lot of people find very hard to wrap their minds around. When you tell them that this stuff is intentional, they get really hurt. And I'm like, do you know where you live? This is how this government moves. This is their playbook. This is their MO. So just letting people know it's intentional. Look who the players are that are involved, and look for their end game. What is the intention? And with a lot of these things, it all goes back to capitalism. This all goes back to capitalism. It is about money. And these folks are not interested in the communities who suffer from the miseducation of their children and the lack of opportunities involved to the young people. These are not people who are thinking about, folks like, my mom used to have to get certain medicines who was by mail. They're not thinking about those people. Those segments of the population don't matter to these folks. And so I think we just have to be very brutally honest and let folks know this is intentional. You need to follow the money. You need to know who the major players involved in these things are, and you need to be aware of what their end game is and understand this is not benevolent. They don't care about you.
If I could add to that just a little bit, excellent points by Angela. Last weekend, Kevin and I wrote about the post office and popular resistance for our weekly newsletter. And one of the points I want to make is right now, this has been going on for a long time, the attack on the post office and trying to weaken it so that they could privatize it. It's gotten people's attention right now because it's impacting the ability to vote. And that's gotten the Democrats' attention. But we know that the only reason the Democrats really care about this right now is because it's impacting the ability to vote. We're part of the Grand Alliance to Save the Post Office that formed back in 2015. The Democrats could have taken action under Obama to support the post office, and they didn't. But now they're paying attention, and as soon as the elections are over, I expect that they'll stop paying attention because they probably get money from Amazon and FedEx and UPS and all those private industries. So we have to make the point to folks, we were out rallying yesterday at our post office. We'll be out Tuesday at the National Day of Action rallying again. People need to understand it's not just the vote that's, at risk here, and this is not just about the vote, and that we have to keep fighting to protect and expand the post office. We could do postal banks and reach the 1/3 of people in the United States that are underbanked. And there's a lot of reasons why we should be protecting and expanding the post office. But I wanted to talk quickly about a movement that's going on around the world, and that's the remunicipalization movement. So cities that are taking back control of water, of schools, internet, and other entities. And so there's a website called publicfutures.org. It's a new project that's documenting these efforts around the world, and not only documenting, but also documenting how people have been able to conduct those. So I think, that's something that we could look to and something that we can do at home to start looking at. Like in Baltimore a few years ago, they tried to privatize our water with Veolia. And in Baltimore, we fought back and stopped that. So these are things that we can do in our community, that through these struggles, we educate how neoliberalism works, how capitalism works, and why public ownership and democratic control are so essential.
Oh, a silent time. Well, hell. I just had an amazing discovery of something that you would think by age 69 I would have figured this out, of what I actually am. Why I don't seem to fit in with the Democratic Party, and why I'm uncomfortable with some of the things Bernie does, and why I've never voted for a Republican, and so forth, and why the libertarians seem a little bit strange to me, and I can't quite put my finger on it. And I found out that I'm a leftist. I didn't really understand that before, and now I finally found out what I am. And the Green Party is the leftist party, and that's one of the reasons I gravitated to it. We're the only American party that occupies the lower left quadrant of the political spectrum. And so consequently, we're non-authoritarianism, and we're on the left side of almost every issue you can imagine, quite a bit on the left side. And it's our primary purpose to pull the rest of these guys that ended up being crowded into the upper right side, the conservatives and the authoritarians and corporatists and all those people. They need to be pulled with a hard pull to the left and downward to make things actually operate again in this country. So I just thought that was interesting. I've been posting about it every time.
So can we do final comments for healthcare in Cuba, and then we can take a break for the candidate forum?
Sounds good. I've been waiting for a final comment. Okay, Margaret Flowers said something about the need for a national leadership and policy to deal with COVID-19. I want to point out that in addition to Cuba having an incredibly low number of cases of deaths from COVID-19, at the same time that data came out, the data came out that Laos has had 0 deaths from COVID-19. Now, Laos is very close, is next to China and not that far from Wuhan province where it all began. But Laos has a national policy, and immediately when COVID-19 hit, they did all of the things that physicians in the United States know very well that the United States should be doing but did not do. When I was doing research on my book on Cuba, I noticed that when I read a lot of Cuban documents, people would say, oh, well, Comandante Fidel came up with this idea, and Comandante Fidel, proposed this idea. And so I went through some of the doctors who lived through that, and I said, Fidel didn't come up with all that stuff, did he? And they said, no, of course not. The physicians came up with that, and they went through the National Medical Association, to present the ideas of what change was needed. And what Fidel did was to popularize those ideas around the country so that people understood the changes before they happened, why they were necessary, and what was going to happen. And I think that's really what's core of the medical transformation, is that we need a national leadership which is able to listen to physicians, which are then able to listen to people, and so that everybody is involved in developing a national policy. One of the reasons why I could never support a Democrat is that Democrats never listen to people except as what's the best way to bamboozle and trick people. I think with people like Howie Hawkins and Angela Walker as leaders, one of the things which they have the ability to do, which the Democrats and Republicans have no ability to do, is to listen to people who really know about medical policy and the ability to really develop a national medical policy that flows upward from the people through the medical experts to the top leadership of the nation.
Want to go second, Angela, or do you want me to go and then you can clean it up?
Well, I like to leave it to the experts, so absolutely, yes, go ahead.
Thanks. We're all experts in some way. The points I think that I would like to make is that the 2020s is a really critical time as we're facing all these crises, and at the same time, the United States as an empire is failing. We're becoming a failing state. It's debated whether we are a failed state or a failing state. We're losing power in the world as the world becomes a multilateral, structure, not dominated by one power. And so we have a lot of responsibility during this next decade to build a left movement and to push our country in that direction, because we could just as easily go to the right and become much more fascist. And so that's our responsibility. And I think it's important for us as people who live in the United States to recognize that we are part of the Americas. Like we, in our typical you know, American exceptionalism, call ourselves the Americans, but actually we are one country of the Americas, and the people in Venezuela consider themselves Americans too. So how do we broaden out our perspective to recognize that we are part of the Americas, and to act more in solidarity with the people in the countries that are part of the Americas as they are fighting US imperialism in Latin America. We are also fighting it here at home as this empire sucks more and more away from us. It's an empire economy that we live in right now, and it's hurting us. And so we can learn from our friends in Latin American countries about this resistance. One thing I find in Venezuela is the level of political education is so far superior to what we see here in the United States. And their structures for maintaining that level of political education are something that we could really learn from. So, as well as learning about the ways that they have handled housing and education and access to food and water and jobs and things like that. So I think more that we can bring the stories, because people are so misinformed in the United States, of how things are done in Latin America, and show the successes that they have. People in Venezuela asked us, they were like, when you go back, can you please tell people about our good programs and the great things that we do here, so that people can understand that they're building these alternatives, and that we have common visions and common ways that we want our societies to function, can start to break through a lot of that myth and help to build this international solidarity, which we are going to need if we're going to bring this empire down in a way that is safe for everyone. I'll stop there.
Usually when the United States has problems with another country and you trace the money trail back, you'll find that they've got a resource that we want. They've got oil or bananas or opium or something. There's something in that country that we want, and that's the root of the disagreement, really. We don't pick on countries that have no resources. Typically, we don't give Somalia a lot of trouble most of the time.
I think that one of the things that is a goal of our campaign is making sure that people understand that healthcare is not a privilege. It is a human right. And what we have been conditioned, so many things that we have been conditioned to accept in this country, and things that, you know, when you bring them to people, they think that they're aspirational. When you point out to them that in countries that have less resources by design, but countries that have less resources than the United States are making this work perfectly and are putting their people first. I think that, you know, one of the things that, you know, both Margaret and Don touched on is that we're surrounded by examples. And one of the things that I see happening, because we are also in the middle of a rebellion. And, you know, we've got a pandemic, we've got a rebellion, and we've got this looming crisis of evictions and financial instability that are happening. And like someone said in the chat, if there has never been a better time for revolution, this time is right now. We are literally standing in this place, this intersection, where when we are talking about these things, people are not looking at us the way they did in 2016 or the way they did in 2012, like, okay, that's great, but it's not doable. People want to know now how you're going to make it happen, because I'm with this. I'm ready for this. And being able to give them examples, like, look at what Cuba has done. Cuba is pushing in literacy. Cuba is pushing in organic agriculture and centering their people and their needs above profit. We've got a neighbor 90 miles to the south of this country that is showing us how this is supposed to be done. And we've got these examples. And the world, I think it's important for us to also know that the world is ready for us to stop being an international jackass and bully. And they are ready for us to start leading with integrity, with transparency, and with compassion and a spirit of cooperation. And I think we have an opportunity right now to do that. And those of us on the left and particularly those of us in the Green Party, it's time, and stand on it.